In July of 1926, a document was signed. It altered the trajectory of a woman's life. Her presence was not required. Her consent was not requested. Her understanding was never sought. The document declared her legally incapable. It stated she could not manage her own affairs. That determination carried sweeping consequences. At the time, declarations like this were framed as protective. They were described as necessary. They were said to preserve order. They were meant to prevent harm. In practice, they functioned differently. They functioned as instruments of quiet erasure. According to the law, no courtroom appearance was necessary. No defense was required. The authority of the signatories was considered sufficient. With ink and formality, a transformation occurred. A person became a problem to be managed. She was no longer an individual to be heard. The document still exists, not in its original form. It survives only as a reference number. It appears in later ledgers. It is cross-listed in administrative indexes. Those indexes survived multiple restructurings. The language of the document is clinical. It is stripped of detail. It is reduced to legal function. What followed the signing does not exist as a complete record. There are no preserved medical summaries. There are no explanations of outcomes. There is no correspondence archived in family collections. There are no photographs. There are no personal effects. There is only a trail, partial references, vague annotations, deliberate absences. The disappearance is not dramatic. It is procedural. During the early decades of the 20th century, authority expanded. Local boards were empowered to decide who was fit. They determined who could live independently. These boards operated under broad mandates. Their stated purpose was protection. They claimed to guard society from instability. They sought to prevent dependency. They aimed to address perceived moral decay. Their criteria were intentionally flexible. Emotional volatility could be cited. Resistance to authority could be noted. Nonconformity was often enough. Inconsistent employment was considered evidence. The system did not require malicious intent. It required only consensus. It required paperwork. The woman at the center of this case lived quietly. She was largely unnoticed until she was noticed for the wrong reasons. She did not marry. That alone placed her outside expectation. She held employment sporadically, sometimes for months, sometimes leaving without explanation. She avoided public gatherings. She did not cultivate relationships with neighbors. Those who later described her used careful language. Their words suggested unease. They did not describe fear. She was distant. She was withdrawn. She was difficult to understand. No one described her as violent. No one described her as threatening. The problem was not danger. It was deviation. Deviation was often enough. Once the declaration was signed, her status changed immediately. She was no longer recognized as someone whose consent carried weight. Decisions could be made on her behalf. No explanation was required. No justification was necessary. Objections could be recorded, not as dissent, but as confirmation of illness. The law framed this shift as care. In practice, it removed safeguards that might have allowed resistance. A transport order was issued within days. The destination was a state-funded care facility. It was located beyond the town's residential boundaries. It was separated from public view. Distance ensured isolation. Facilities like this were common. They were presented as progressive. They were described as modern. They embodied new thinking about social welfare. They emphasized mental health. Official descriptions highlighted cleanliness. They emphasized routine. They promoted professional oversight. What they did not emphasize was permanence. Visitors were discouraged, not through prohibition, but through procedure. Visiting hours were limited. Approval was required. Social pressure did the rest. Letters sent by patients were reviewed. They were examined before leaving the facility. Letters received were often delayed. Sometimes they were redacted. Sometimes they were withheld entirely. Records were maintained internally. They were shared only when required. Administrative review determined access. The system trusted itself. That trust was rarely questioned. Daily life followed a strict rhythm. Patients awoke at assigned times. They assembled for inspection. They moved according to schedule. Meals were timed. Silence was enforced. Privacy was minimal. Personal possessions were restricted. Individual preference was irrelevant. Compliance was documented as improvement. Resistance was documented as pathology. Medical notes from this era show a pattern. It appears across thousands of cases. Words like calm appear frequently. Words like cooperative are repeated. Words like manageable are common. Descriptions of internal experience are rare. Treatment was standardized. It was not individualized. Refusal was not interpreted as disagreement. It was interpreted as illness. The system could not recognize dissent. To do so would undermine authority. Early references to her were brief. They described behavior. They noted responses to treatment. Over time, references became shorter. Observations became formulaic. Her name appeared less frequently. It was replaced by a number. The number streamlined documentation. The process was efficient. It also enabled disappearance. Numbers are easier to misplace than names. Years later, a discrepancy appeared. It surfaced during a routine audit. A transfer log referenced a patient. The intake date matched hers. The case number matched precisely. The log indicated movement. It suggested transfer within the system. No discharge documentation could be found. There was no release authorization. There was no death certificate. There was no destination recorded. In a system defined by paperwork, absence mattered. The absence of paperwork was notable. Only one annotation appeared. It was brief. It was vague. A handwritten remark read simply, "File consolidated." There was no explanation, no reference to a new archive, no indication of authorization. The notation closed the issue administratively. It resolved nothing substantively. Staff members noticed the inconsistency. Questions were raised quietly. Later recollections suggest this. They were preserved incidentally. They appeared in unrelated reports. The questions were not pursued. The explanation offered was clerical error. It was described as unavoidable. Large systems manage large volumes. That explanation was accepted. Challenging it would imply failure. Institutions resist that possibility. Institutions do not rely on cruelty alone. They rely on routine. They rely on repetition. They rely on normalization. Silence becomes acceptable. Omissions produce no consequences. Questions become discouraged. Eventually, they stop being asked. Disappearance becomes a process, not an event. There is no evidence of escape. There is no evidence of recovery. There is no evidence of violence. There is simply nothing. The absence is complete. In systems built on documentation, absence is evidence. It suggests control, not chaos. By the mid-1930s, restructuring occurred. Administrative authority shifted. Departments merged. Files were reviewed. Some were archived. Others were destroyed. They were deemed outdated. They were considered redundant. Committees made these decisions. Their concern was efficiency, not accountability. When records vanish, intent is unclear. Accident and removal become indistinguishable. The result is the same. Her name appears one final time. It is in a surviving ledger. There is no date. There is no status. There is no conclusion. The entry is incomplete. Surrounding pages show where. They appear to have been handled repeatedly. After that, she does not appear again. Officially, the case was closed. The system considered it resolved. It no longer generated questions. Unofficially, nothing was resolved. There was no answer. There was only silence. History records what survives. It records what is archived. It records what is filed. It does not record what is excluded. Some stories are forgotten because they are insignificant. Others are forgotten deliberately. Remembering them requires responsibility. This was one of those stories. No witnesses were required. No testimony was recorded. No public reckoning occurred. Only a document, a process, a disappearance. No trace loud enough to interrupt routine. What remains is not a record of events. It is evidence of permission for this to happen. Cases like this matter, not because they are rare, but because they are common. They represent systemic failure. They reveal systems without scrutiny. They show how order replaces justice. They show how silence replaces resolution. They show how legality obscures morality. They show how procedure replaces accountability. This story survives only in fragments. It exists between documents, not within them. It was never meant to be remembered. It was never meant to be witnessed. Unwitnessed.